Lawful disclaimer and notice of intent. This podcast and all related content are created, owned, operated, and sponsored exclusively by me, the sole author, speaker, and producer. Any other product, service, and/or entity, living or non-living, which may be discussed, displayed, and/or somehow given attention on this podcast is not and has never been an endorsement, advertisement, support, and/or any other kind of validation for its existence in any capacity, nor at all intended to at all facilitate its continued existence in any capacity. I mention things on what I consider to be an as-needed basis to fulfill what I consider adequate as evidence in my best attempt to prove the reality of who I am and what this podcast is attempting to achieve to clearly demonstrate what I consider to thoroughly substantiate my assertions. I act simultaneously in private and public capacities, and this podcast reflects my direct and autonomous expression. It is created and published from within Canada, but is intended for a global audience, including legal jurisdictions in the United States and all common law nations. All statements, views, and narratives presented are based solely on my personal experiences, perceptions, and understanding of the reality I am facing, including ongoing egregious defamation, targeted harassment, and credible threats to my safety and life. I do not and never have claimed that my views aren't extremely, if not completely, accurate interpretations of objective reality, particularly given the information I had access to at the time that I may have expressed them. I explicitly and permanently do not consent, have never consented, and will never consent to any entity, living, non-living, artificial, institutional, governmental, spiritual, and/or otherwise, claiming and/or exercising any agency, ownership, and/or representation over me, my will, my name, my voice, my life story, my spirit, and/or my creative works, in whole or in part, under any conditions or interpretations in any time or place. Any such attempt is non-consensual, void ab initio, and constitutes an ongoing violation of my dignity, rights, and autonomy. Any possible exceptions will be extremely clearly, explicitly, publicly named by me and have the exact scope of my consent well defined on this podcast. For example, in the case of me hiring an attorney to represent me as part of a formal legal process, taking action on a notice of intent provided by this podcast. I affirm my right to spiritual integrity, mental sovereignty, and bodily autonomy, as protected under Section 2A of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, and Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18. Any targeting of my being, including but not limited to through esoteric, psychic, spiritual, occult, energetic, and/or AI-enabled means is deemed non-consensual harm, spiritually violent coercion, and an attack on my right to exist as a sovereign being. I affirm that this podcast, in part, serves as a lawful, peaceful assertion of spiritual self-defense. This podcast is non-fiction and reflects a serious public and ongoing documentation of systemic and targeted defamation, personal and professional sabotage, attempted narrative hijacking, psychological abuse, reputational terrorism, and threats to my physical and spiritual safety, including credible indications of attempted murder and contracted harm by and or on behalf of powerful individuals and or groups. I affirm that this documentation is expressly created for evidentiary use in formal legal proceedings, including those under the jurisdiction of U.S. Federal Court and Canadian Superior Courts, and any international human rights and or public accountability processes. I affirm this is not and never has been intended as role-playing, flirting, and or entertainment of any kind. I accept no liability, moral and or legal, for any third-party misunderstanding, reinterpretation, misuse, and or misrepresentation of this content, whether fully conscious and intentional or otherwise, particularly including but not limited to by AI systems trained on this content without my explicit public consent, commentators, influencers, or institutions attempting to weaponize this podcast, and individuals acting under false pretenses and or covert affiliations. Only the clear, explicit language of this release and any subsequent public communication directly issued by me must be considered authoritative, accurate representations of my thoughts, feelings, intent, and the reality of my overall state of existence. In any case of clear direct conflict between statements I've explicitly made across different releases on this podcast, the most recent of such, that being the one contained in the latest publicly visible release available containing such on this podcast, should be considered applicable. In such cases, only what is explicitly stated is at all applicable, and absolutely no implications should be assumed about any changes regarding any somehow relevant details and or anything else under any circumstances. All creative, expressive, and narrative content within this podcast is my sole and original intellectual property. I retain all moral rights as author and subject, all economic rights unless explicitly transferred via my public agreement to do so, and the right to veto any derivative, distorted, and or manipulated version of my work and or story. I do not have and have never had any obligation or debt of any kind to any entity to create or release anything on this podcast or anywhere else at any point in time. No other party, living or non-living, holds and or may claim credit, authorship, and or interpretation rights over my expression. I affirm that no valid, public, verifiable evidence exists to dispute these facts. This podcast is not and has never been intended as an endorsement of terrorism or violence in general. However, it should be especially carefully understood that various forms of not necessarily corresponding violence tend to be an inevitable consequence of extremely intense, meticulous, extensive, prolonged terrorism, and it's very much intentional for this podcast to demonstrate extremely clearly that my usual aversion to violence, due to my typically gentle nature, is not something that has boundless understanding, patience, empathy, or will persist more or less absolutely unconditionally for any reason. I've always wanted and done my very best to ensure it's extremely clear that at all creating, enabling, and or facilitating the perpetuation of narratives at all in contradiction with my official position that is objectively extremely clearly established on this podcast is not, never has been, and never will be what I've been trying to achieve with this podcast or in general in any of my efforts at any point in time. I do not and never have intentionally incited terrorism, including but not limited to violence, blackmail, and or coercion. I affirm my fundamental intent as peaceful, lawful, and self-defensive. However, targeted campaigns to stalk, defame, threaten, impoverish, silence, spiritually attack, and or physically harm me will be treated as conspiracies to commit grievous harm and or murder. This podcast is an affirmative public notice of my unambiguous non-consent and a lawful response to sustained systemic abuse. While my fundamental intent in communicating in general through any means is not and has never been malicious in nature, I affirm it can, will, and should exert malicious influence upon anything operating with malice towards me and or this podcast, especially more so the more demonstrably I'm proving that malice exists. And it should be understood that any situation where I continue not to extremely clearly receive any compensation or reward I'm willing to accept is effectively, absolutely, unconditionally an increase in the severity of that malice. I've created the entirety of this podcast under extremely harsh circumstances that I've always believed and asserted are entirely unjust for me to be left in, given the reality of who I am. Circumstances of my existence, including but not limited to my current housing status, financial vulnerability, and material limitations, do not and cannot invalidate my legal personhood, expressive rights, and or entitlement to protection under law. I reject any attempt to diminish my credibility and or rights on the basis of poverty, social class, and or housing insecurity in accordance with Section 7 of the Canadian Charter, the Due Process Clause of the U.S. Constitution, and international law prohibiting discrimination on the basis of economic status. Despite the extent I've irrefutably exposed the truth surrounding a conflict that should have been so extremely obviously recognized as extremely serious to the point that my efforts on this podcast should have made a substantial difference in my life long ago, my life circumstances continue to not have meaningfully or clearly improved at all whatsoever. I still have not ever received any compensation or reward of any kind whatsoever for any of my efforts at all involving the conflict being addressed by this podcast, neither directly nor indirectly from any source. I am, always have been, and always will be absolutely unconditionally unwilling to ever at all accept any compensation or reward whatsoever, directly or indirectly, that at all compromises my integrity, whether directly or indirectly. I do not, never have, and never will consent to it being at all considered to be me and or any entity operating at all with my consent and or best interests regarding any communication somehow claiming and or implying that I somehow do ever have and or ever will unofficially support any kind of position at all contradictory with what I've said on this podcast. This disclaimer and notice of intent supersedes any and all contrary interpretations, explicitly including any and all unauthorized claims therein made against me. I reserve all legal, expressive, spiritual, moral, and intellectual rights without limitation. Any attempt to silence, reinterpret, discredit, and or co-opt this documentation must be treated as malicious bad faith conduct and may be cited in formal legal proceedings as evidence of further targeting. Pursuant to Section 7 and Section 15 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, I allege that the Government of Canada and its agents have failed in their duty to protect my life, liberty, and security of the person, and have discriminated against me on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation. My sincere identity as a lesbian trans woman is being made a complete mockery of and being framed as some kind of disingenuous, financially incentivized and or contractual obligation under some supposed indebtedness to someone or something. I'm being treated like my authentic expression is some kind of role-playing that completely discredits the fundamental truth of what I've been saying about an ongoing conspiracy and attempts to murder me in real life that I'm entirely undeserving of and obviously have always been entirely unwanted by me. I've literally proven the Canadian government has been knowingly leaving me vulnerable to conspiracy and attempted murder despite irrefutable video evidence from a government-owned building. I've even explicitly expressed extremely serious life-threatening concerns to the staff of that same government building multiple times. There's literally irrefutable video evidence of a hitman that was within just a few meters away from me, explicitly talking about being about to murder someone loud enough I could hear it right outside of a government-owned building where certainly at least one of the 3 or more government-owned cameras that he was within range of must have heard him. Yet I remain in exactly the same amount of danger, susceptible to the same thing, and very possibly much worse, happening again indefinitely. Further, under Section 3.1 and Section 12 of the Crown Liability and Proceedings Act, I assert that officers, judges, and health officials acting as agents of the Crown have engaged in negligent, corrupt, or fraudulent conduct causing direct harm to me. Even as far back as the manifesto that I was forced to serve a 13.5-month jail sentence that the judge explicitly stated he wouldn't have been satisfied to give me a sentence any lesser than 12 months for. I explicitly stated in that document that I identify as a lesbian trans woman, which obviously has in no small part contributed to discrimination against me. This was grossly, entirely neglected to be at all taken into consideration whatsoever in any legal proceedings in any court hearing I ever attended. It wasn't ever even mentioned, despite the judge recognizing that I'm clearly being neglected by those around me and society as a whole. I've also mentioned my being a lesbian trans woman to Kinney and many others long before I ever wrote that manifesto, but I was made to feel like I should hide it and feel ashamed of who I am instead of welcomed with warmth, love, and respect. I've expressed extremely deep distress to police officers in the past after getting arrested and was mocked as being an arrogant fool. I've explicitly expressed extremely deep distress and concern about the international state of affairs following my initial arrest in front of the judge in a formal courtroom and was sent for a psychiatric evaluation where I was still treated as mentally ill and criminally malicious in intent even after I was deemed not suitable for the mental institution by the licensed practicing professionals evaluating me. The licensed professionals told me to my face that they acknowledge the DSM-5 tries to fit everyone into boxes, and they don't personally believe me to be delusional or otherwise mentally ill, but inflicted egregious defamation of me on their paperwork and framed me as someone extremely delusional and generally quite substantially mentally ill. That all happened in late 2019 and early 2020, literally right as the COVID-19 pandemic started. I literally explicitly told a judge in a formal courtroom that the world is going to start going downhill if I'm not immediately released. He made a complete mockery of my assertion by sending me to a psychological evaluation. I passed it. A global pandemic started while I was being forced to endure that evaluation, and I was still prosecuted as a criminal and incarcerated for several more months amongst violent criminals instead of anyone in the criminal justice system actually caring to take a real look at my case and evaluate it objectively fairly. Canada continues to face crisis after crisis while I have hitmen coming after me and I'm left in extremely life-threatening deprivation and poverty that even the government ignores irrefutable video evidence is entirely unjustified, despite the fact that I'm clearly a far greater good faith actor in any legal capacity than most people in the world. This podcast is also to be considered as me submitting formal requests under Sections 4 and 12 of the Access to Information Act for all personal data and institutional records relating to this matter for use in court proceedings. I've seen reason to believe I've had individuals licensed to practice medicine falsifying records about me, claiming things like prescribing medicine for me when I've never taken any of it and never was even made aware of being given a prescription, as well as various police incident reports that hold no real merit and no evidence to substantiate them, and also that there's most likely various internal memos between various government institutions that have intentionally participated in intentionally torturing me and leaving me in an extremely vulnerable state to ongoing harm as part of a secret government program intended to target individuals to silence them after they've been extremely egregiously abused and neglected. All relevant documents should be sent to the contact email address publicly listed on this podcast's YouTube channel, that being the Dark Red Pill podcast@gmail.com, and not to any other channel or method of communication. Although the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, or FSIA, empowers the Canadian government in that under it, foreign governments, including Canada, are largely immune from lawsuits in U.S. courts unless a specific exception applies, such as commercial activity or terrorism by state sponsors, and Canada is not designated a state sponsor of terrorism, FSIA still does not protect the Canadian government from the fact that commercial activities, that being of various influencers living in California who I've proven have extensive involvement in this conspiracy and attempts to murder me, have done various commercial acts which they certainly deem things like their Twitch streams as under U.S. territory. Under 28 U.S. Code 1605A2, FSIA does not grant immunity when the action is based upon a commercial activity carried on in the United States by the foreign state. I allege that influencers are profiting from targeted harassment and conspiracy tied to Canadian officials or policy. Further, content monetization, YouTube, Twitch, Patreon, etc., supports a conspiracy with a cross-border commercial component. Lily and Imaine's Sweet and Sour podcast has a Patreon as well, only increasingly providing evidence that Imaine's extremely heavily involved, while also herself being from Canada. The failure by the Canadian government to provide adequate attention and protection to me, despite being alerted and having irrefutable evidence of this matter, demonstrates that their willful failure to act enables Imaine's criminal conduct, existentially assaulting me and putting my safety and life in ongoing immediate danger. Accordingly, I intend to pursue a lawsuit against the Corporation of Canada under the jurisdiction of U.S. federal court. Further, the Alien Tort Statute, or ATS, allows for limited claims in U.S. courts for violations of international law, in this case more specifically related to international human rights violations. Although not usually against foreign governments, it's relevant as I've proven various U.S. actors, including very possibly even President Donald Trump, are somehow very much non-trivially involved. I'm clearly being tortured and persecuted despite proving the truth of this matter beyond reasonable doubt. Those I once considered family and friends clearly know beyond reasonable doubt that they've been exceedingly disrespectful, neglectful, and malicious towards me for an extremely prolonged period of time, and multiple of them also knew about my being a lesbian trans woman for a long time. They were emboldened and empowered to commit this immoral and in many cases criminal behavior in no small part due to systemic abuse and the neglect of those in law enforcement and the court officials in the criminal justice system and the medical professionals in the medical system that all discriminated against me for their selfish gain. I'm certain that President Donald Trump must keep up with foreign affairs in relation to the Canadian government. Despite this matter directly being relevant to and increasingly revealing of various issues and corruption within the Canadian government, he continues to adopt what I'd assert is a rather pretentiously negligent attitude towards my existence. I'd suspect at least part of the reason for his attitude towards me is rooted in his discriminatory beliefs against trans women. It should be noted that I don't hold any particular issue with Executive Order 14201, which appears to target exploitation of transgenderism to gain an unfair advantage in sports, or Executive Order 14187, which appears to target exploitation of children by their parents through the government. Although I question Executive Order 14168, on the basis of it seeming to discredit the validity of a perception of self-identity in an extremely deeply fundamentally discriminatory manner. While restricting room for manipulation of legal documents through gender identity makes sense, entirely eliminating capability to express internal identity that may conflict with external circumstances seems exceedingly restrictive in a manner that seems to me like censorship to some extent. Spiritually, I've noticed increasingly egregious violations of my energy, including increasingly disturbing implications of increasingly heavily government-involved targeting of me, particularly by the Canadian government. It almost seems to me like they blame me somehow for various crises that in reality I've never had anything to do with, effectively trying to force me into holding the responsibility of a public government official while possessing a grossly inadequate level of actual perceptible public official authority to actually be in any kind of position where any entity attempting to hold me accountable for various things would ever make any even remotely reasonable sense objectively. I'm seeing ongoing and increasingly egregious heavy involvement relating to both those I once called family and friends, as well as multiple prominent social media influencers and their associates. I don't at all identify with the name Mark, although egregious false narratives about me seem to be enabling and or facilitating me getting my rights violated and my safety put into danger through strangers taking pictures, possibly also drones, in reality entirely against my consent, as part of what is ultimately rooted in a secret government program targeting me for assassination to silence my truth, because various Canadian government officials are well aware of how horrid what they're subjecting me to really is. If I had to try to guess what kind of insane, heavily politically involved word manipulation might be getting used to attempt to justify this, I suspect it has something to do with the city of Markham, where I've spent the vast majority of my life, and connecting that somehow to something like going ham, effectively misrepresenting my perception of what it means to be a savage, painting it as some extremely irrational, unhinged mental illness rooted in self-destructive and generally malicious tendencies and inclinations within my mental framework. The government-owned building I've mentioned in the Hitman incident, as well as the man approaching me near the bag of half-smoked cigarettes, is a building in the city of Markham. I've also noticed an increasingly strange presence of a group of highly suspicious individuals wearing dark blue clothing and giving vibes of being involved in Crip Street gang activity hanging around that building recently. Absolutely none of them are my friends at all, nor do I have any desire to ever become friends with any of them. I suspect it's happening in efforts increasingly trying to justify targeting me and putting me in danger, and I suspect this is in no short measure due to all of those from my past trying to existentially assault me in the ongoing conspiracy and attempts to murder me that try to force me into some weird street gang conflict I've never had or wanted any part of. To make sure I've made it completely clear, I didn't take that bag with the half-smoked cigarettes, nor any of the cigarettes inside. I put down the one I'd been holding shortly after the man walked away, and I didn't go back to pick any of that stuff up later. Within a few hours, staff had cleaned up those trash cans as they were already overflowing at the time the encounter between me and the shady man happened. I have absolutely no regrets about not taking any of the cigarettes and or anything else from that man. I suppose I should mention as well that I do actually pick partially smoked cigarettes off the ground sometimes and even check a very small amount of the cigarette disposal boxes sometimes myself, because I sometimes feel like smoking cigarettes a bit when I'm under extreme stress and feel extremely deeply hated by the world, like I have been, especially ever since I've had to start this podcast literally just to even survive. But I do not and have never wanted, needed, and or tried to get anyone else to collect cigarettes anywhere for me. I'm seeing rapidly increasing reason to believe that those I once called family are at least roughly equally to blame as the several prominent internet influencers involved in the ongoing conspiracy and attempts to murder me and the extremely life-threatening deprivation and danger I remain in. I've been increasingly frequently noticing egregious violations of my energy by Caroline. I recall someone with a name spelled exactly the same but pronounced Carleen among those I once called family, who I haven't even seen in well over a decade. This Caroline energy most recently, very shortly after the last release I made on this podcast, was egregiously lying that I'm much closer with those I once called family than I really am. Lying that anyone actually has a phone number they can reliably contact me at, in direct contradiction with the explicit statement I made on the matter publicly on this podcast not that long ago. That energy was claiming to be trying to connect me with people that can help me and bring real justice to this situation, but it felt extremely perverted and gross, and I didn't trust it at all. At this point, I suspect someone named Caroline to be deceiving Aria, Celine, Jessica, Kimmy, and at least 3 others who I'm unsure of the identities of. They could have the zodiac signs Cancer, Pisces, and Leo, but don't try to make it fit. I don't trust that energy at all, and it literally might just be a completely fabricated triangle of trust that she's operating entirely on her own to attempt to endlessly perpetuate, exerting an extremely abusive, coercive control over my life and increasingly aggressively conspire and attempt to have me murdered in real life entirely unjustly through. As for my personal experience with someone I once called family with a name spelled the same, I haven't seen her or her brother or their parents in well over a decade, probably about half my life, so about 15, 16 years now. And while I personally don't feel we were on particularly bad terms, I really don't know or care how they see me and those I was connected closer to in that whole family, while I still at all considered myself a part of it, and I certainly never felt we were on any kind of particularly good terms either. To make sure I'm being extremely clear about everything. Although I've texted Leslie in the past, I don't still have access to any of the numbers I've ever texted her using. I've actually texted her through more than one different number in the past, but they were all free texting app numbers. You know, the ones that expire your number if you don't use it for a few weeks. I first contacted Leslie to inform her that her number had been leaked by Kimmy, and then a couple of times years ago, much later, to sternly tell her to tell Kimmy to check her emails and that I was serious about my position. But it was never intended to be flirting, and I've never been sharing any secrets with Leslie through any means. It was literally just intended to try to force everyone to take me more seriously, since I felt so egregiously disrespected and neglected by literally everyone and didn't know what else to do. I even have a theory about how the Caroline energy might be trying to manipulate people to fabricate a connection between us. Through John, when I lived with him briefly to try to survive hitmen that were already coming after me constantly at one point, John stole a toothbrush I was using from me. It mysteriously disappeared one day, and he claimed to have no idea what happened to it, just like the birth certificate thing with Dixon. But John specifically pressured me to use a toothbrush I left in his house back then in the first place, and he also specifically pressured me to use a comb that was originally his that I left in his house as well, so I suspect he's also went and used that for some kind of witchcraft or some kind of thing to frame me for crimes entirely against my consent to my detriment. I also suspect he was illegally recording audio and or video of me on multiple occasions entirely against my consent without my knowledge during the time he was in my life as well. And then there's Lily's energy that's been increasingly violating mine these days as well. Not in such a direct manner as Jessica's has, but increasingly to my detriment nonetheless. Lily's lying that she's trying to be a better person. She's not actually taking any actions to even remotely adequately substantiate it. She's aggressively trying to get me murdered in real life in the very near future, lying that she's helping me and or very powerful people will help me. Her energy's been trying to force people I don't want, and it should be exceedingly obvious to Lily that I don't want, onto me, and acting like it's justified because she wants to act like I'm some hater of her. Her energy is increasingly abusively trying to misrepresent me as having some kind of fetish for morbidly obese women currently, from what I can tell. So it seems her general pattern of abusive behavior really likes to grossly exaggerate anything at all strange that I say, perverting an unusual perspective into an extremely grossly integrity compromising, in reality extremely unappealing and unpleasant reality for me. Obviously entirely against my consent to my detriment. Granted, I imagine I'm reading her energy like that, probably in no small part because of Chloe's egregious defamation of me that has been trying to rob me of my soul and the protection that comes along with it. Again, Chloe has always been doing so entirely against my consent, to my detriment, and I've never been trying to at all protect her and or anyone else, enabling and or facilitating her intentions and efforts as such. Clearly, Chloe's been operating most aggressively through Lily, but that's only all the more reason why Lily herself must definitely know that extremely clearly by now, meaning she's intentionally trying to avoid accountability by using Emayne and Trump as a shield. Lily's extreme carelessness and malicious, selfish enabling and facilitation of Chloe's egregious disrespect and neglect and absolutely unconditional, unrestrained, malicious intent towards me has cascaded into Leslie's life and the trio of Kimmy, Jamie, and Jessica being puppeteered by Edison against my consent to my detriment. Lily had many opportunities to question what she was hearing and try to communicate directly with me to confirm things, but she chose to never do so. She clearly preferred to believe the lies because it was much more convenient for her and everyone feeding off her energy, exploiting me. I'm seeing increasing indications that Lily's been a lot more involved than I previously thought in purporting egregious lies that I'm much more involved in the music industry than I've ever actually been as well, and misrepresenting my ideal lifestyle massively through that as well. But I also still believe Kimmy herself is largely to blame as well. From what I can tell, and is becoming a lot more increasingly clear to me, Kimmy's really been lying extremely badly that anime is a lot more prominent and relevant to my life than it's ever actually been or ever would actually be. In the process, she's effectively been trying to make me seem like I see life as one huge fake show that ultimately doesn't really matter, projecting extremely heavily because clearly that's how she actually views life. It's like the only reason she actually cares whether she lives or dies is because she can't try to play God with others' lives if she's dead. And then she's been trying to make me seem like I'm like that, to make people hate me for what's in reality her garbage personality, while she portrays herself like the angel that I'm the one actually being all along. One thing that should demonstrate the egregious extent of Kimmy's anime-related defamation of me has already become exceedingly apparent to me. The name Rick holds no particular meaning to me. However, spiritually, it seems Kimmy's been using that name and narratives about anime to frame me as someone who's been extremely lazy until I started this podcast. She's been trying to make it seem like I haven't even really been trying at all in life until after I turned 30 years old, when in reality I've been working extremely hard ever since, even before I ever met her, even in my very early 20s. Presumably, she's using these egregious lies to attempt to justify her destiny swapping type behavior, where she's been trying to steal a lot, if not all, of the credit for what's in reality always been entirely my own work that I worked extremely hard to write among the hundreds of essays of emails that I've sent to my mailing list over time until it reached the point I started this podcast. And the Jamie and or Lena energy is quite prominently violating my energy still as well. It seems those pieces of trash have been trying extremely hard to paint me as a careless party animal type that's going to start ignoring all this chaos and mess they've all too eagerly forced into my life, laughing and walking away like massive narcissists anytime they should defend me at all, and then trying to frame me as being the type to do that to them. Both of them are quite exceedingly creepy to me at this point, especially Lena. Like, Jamie, maybe I can understand she was just really young and dumb when I met her, and she got really infatuated or something. But this Lena creep is absolutely unhinged and is seriously endangering Jamie's life increasingly maliciously with every passing day from what I'm seeing. As for Edison, I believe he knows what he's doing, to the point that he knows quite clearly that attacking me is extremely wrong and I'm not some evil demon so many attempt to portray me as, but someone he considers a master. I suspect Tate and or Trump are telling him to attack me anyway, while also knowing the truth. It's sort of hard to tell who exactly it is he considers a master, since it's an energy to some extent shrouded in Kimmy's lies about anime and Chloe's lies about ever being an even remotely decent person to me in her life. But Edison definitely knows he's using Kimmy, Jamie, and Jessica for his own selfish gain, and that attacking me through them is not only extremely reckless, but also puts them all in extreme danger, because I can and will fight back, and can and will cause their deaths in real life if they keep conspiring and attempting to murder me. The energy Edison's operating from could also have more to do than I originally thought in relation to egregious defamation of me involving Kimmy and or escorts I've had moments of sexual intimacy with in the past, making claims about the circumstances related to them having a secret child. They've been trying to exploit me to dump their negative karma onto me for a luxurious life they've been trying to live at my expense entirely against my consent. Although I've never actually done anything sexual in person with Kimmy, I get the feeling she's been somehow heavily benefiting off operating within the energy of the escorts I actually have done sexual things with once or twice before in my life, although I've repeated countless times the truth that I've never done anything sexual with Kimmy in person. That probably circles back to the narratives related to pedophilic activities that Kimmy and Jamie have some kind of involvement in together. I've seen lies being purported in my energy claiming I'm adopted. I don't believe myself to be adopted, and whether or not I am doesn't matter to me. However, I suspect narratives around the topic are related to egregious defamation of me that finds particular relevancy in whether or not I'm adopted in order to facilitate those I once called family trying to endlessly steal my energy through trying to manipulate me into believing I've cut off all energetic ties to them, while in reality they keep trying to frame me as ever being an at-all knowing and or consenting participant in all the crimes they've committed against me and the harm they've by extension done to others through exploitation, disrespect, and neglect of me that I'm only increasingly proving every day was intended to drive me crazy and leave me committing suicide, left in and out, or permanently trapped in a mental institution for life, or in jail or prison or murdered. I specifically suspect that egregiously false narratives related to the significance of me being or not being adopted are being used to target staff of that same government-owned building that I assert the cameras around contain irrefutable video evidence of hitmen sent after me, and that the incident with the man and the half-smoked cigarettes occurred. Specifically, I suspect a woman named Karen is being targeted for being kind to me and giving me food and or coffee for free sometimes because I've shared some broader, non-specific details about how I'm going through a difficult time and stuff with her. She's also the first staff member of the building that I told about the hitman incident. She's told me before that she's adopted, although I don't know if that's true or not, and I don't particularly care either. I watched the first couple hours of Kimmy's latest stream, but it didn't really seem like much particularly worth addressing, at least certainly not nearly with the kind of urgency I feel about releasing what I'm saying right now in this release. I noticed Jessica's energy further egregiously violating mine, and after checking, I actually learned she'd streamed shortly before my last release on this podcast. I actually didn't know that at the time I was making it, and the stream I was talking about in my last release when I said Jessica's latest stream didn't seem relevant to me was the stream Jessica had actually done prior, where she was just playing Valorant. But her actual latest stream, as of the time I made my last release, does actually have a bit of stuff that further substantiates my assertions I'm making in this release.
I'm using my friend Nicole's sourdough bread that she made, so I'm super excited. Oh my god. I should not be in the kitchen today. Someone should cook for me. Nicole's sourdough saved it.
I really don't know where this Nicole girl that Kimmy and Jessica suddenly have become such good friends with that they've been mentioning on their streams randomly came from, but I've already mentioned what that name reminds me of personally. I don't have any evidence it's the Nicole that's my cousin, and if it's anything like the Caroline situation, then it probably isn't, but it appears to indicate spiritual violation of my energy so egregiously by those I once called family that how greatly Kimmy and her associates have facilitated it has led to it bleeding into their personal lives and ultimately professional lives. I don't know what exactly sourdough bread's all about, if it has some secret meaning or something, but it seems to me that Jessica was upset she had to stream at all. She seemed to feel justified in expecting someone else to cook for her, and maybe I'm reading her behavior wrong, but it sort of seems to me like whoever's stressing her out and depriving her of that has been lying that I'm putting her through that suffering because I extremely creepily, desperately crave seeing her show off her butt on stream even just a little. That's some really gross energy, and I most certainly do not claim it. I'm just going to take this even a step further and try to energetically read into Kimmy's starting soon stream a bit as well. The Japanese text obviously relates to Kimmy's abuse of the Japanese language to exploit me, which I imagine, given how she tried to delegate responsibility for it onto Jamie, actually originates from Chloe and how she's been violating Lily's energy and brand in an extremely devious manner for extremely selfish gain, entirely to my detriment against my consent, and then lying that I've ever been trying to enable and or facilitate her criminal activity she's been engaging in by doing so. The only other thing that particularly stands out to me is the Game Boy Color in the middle, which reminds me of one of Mary's brothers, Milton Sade. When I was a child, Milton bought me a Game Boy Color and Pokemon Yellow. To my knowledge, Milton lives in the United States right now, California specifically. I have no idea what exactly he's doing there, but he moved out of Canada many years ago as far as I'm aware. He was actually a pretty nice guy to me all around for the time I knew him, but I most certainly wouldn't trust him or want to associate with him at all after seeing how so many of his family members have abused, disrespected, and neglected me, and clearly been involved in the ongoing conspiracy and attempts to murder me in real life. Given how I'm pretty sure he lives in California, where Kimmy and many of her associates live, I believe it's not unreasonable to believe they know him and have been conspiring against me with him to some extent. This isn't intended as an unlawful or YouTube rule-breaking call to action to murder anyone, but given the extent I've been egregiously, blatantly, publicly, officially conspired against to be murdered in a manner I've only increasingly, irrefutably been proving is entirely unjust, I'm retaliating in self-defense by explicitly stating that the Twitch streamers Angels Kimmy, Edison Park Live, Star Smitten, iGumdrop, Jessica, Pokimane, Lily Pichu, Ariasaki, Valkyrie, NMPLOL, Foosley, and Big Skinger, as well as the digital creator Lena Lemon, and the private individuals Mary Aslin, Dixon Aslin, Kristen Aslin, John Sade, Vivian Sade, Nicole Sade, Carlene Sade, Milton Sade, Chloe Chan Kin, Jerry Cow, Herman Hum, and Matthew Wu come off to me as being so extremely heavily at fault for the ongoing conspiracy and attempts to murder me in real life to the point that I see them as objectively deserving of being murdered in real life in the very near future if I cannot have the kind of connection with Kimmy that I've always wanted starting in the very near future. Especially since that is and will forever be literally the only manner in which I feel at all safe in life and actually to be receiving a life I actually want and would sincerely enjoy living. That connection includes her either never having had children or any children she's ever had being sacrificed, and yes, that means murdered in real life, beyond any ability for resuscitation, to the Shadow Confederation. And not solely as some kind of public display. I'm talking actually in reality, so even behind the scenes in private as well. Eliminated. For real. I don't care who they're sacrificed to or why. Just gone. They never should have existed to begin with. That connection also most certainly is not one where I continue to see complete reluctance from Kimmy to at all meaningfully or adequately give me attention, communication, and sexual satisfaction in person. I've already explained how the egregious extent of entirely non-consensual and detrimental exploitation of my existence and efforts that Kimmy's enabled and facilitated in the manner she's done so means me ever at all validating or even being remotely okay with tolerating her ever having children with anyone for any reason at any point in time effectively becomes me displaying having a death wish. She was clearly perfectly fine with continuing to treat me in a manner where she obviously must have known it shows her extreme disliking for ever actually having children as well. So before you claim I'm calling for the murder of children with some kind of immorality, understand I simply value my continued existence more than at all enabling and or facilitating Kimmy and or anyone else extremely selfishly benefiting off pretending to want children with anyone ever at my expense against my consent. Nobody ever had any even remotely actually adequate reason to believe that would ever at all be okay with me. It's not, never was, and never will be. Also, again, I'm referring to human children, not non-human pets like Kimmy's cat Snowball. Non-human pets don't count as children to me in this context. I'm increasingly extremely concerned about Kimmy actually being pregnant and possibly even beyond the 3-month typical abortion viability window. For anyone that might try to claim I'm a murderer because I'm supposedly lazy and that's why I didn't clarify everything fast enough to convince her to get an abortion earlier if she's actually pregnant and I'm now putting her in an extremely difficult spot, kill yourself. She never actually said or did anything to even remotely adequately even imply being pregnant until her most recent stream, extremely concerningly, had her blatantly explicitly say it in an extremely concerningly possibly serious manner. I'm not going to operate on insane paranoia that she's pregnant at all times on top of all the absolute insanity I have to deal with. That's an absolutely unreasonable expectation to have of me. I've been in increasingly brutal, life-threatening deprivation, in and out of homelessness and struggling to survive while barely ever even having enough money for food for the last nearly decade, if I've had any money at all, working long hours with very few days off the entire time. Definitely more than a full-time job with absolutely zero pay for it. I'm not goddamn lazy. If I was at all inclined towards laziness, I would have already been murdered long ago with the amount of hitmen that have been sent after me and the amount of extremely egregious narcissistic abuse I've had to overcome to reach the kind of position in life I have. I should single-handedly have the authority to override any moral standard set by anyone when it comes to Kimmy having children, and I should be able to command she has no children ever, and my will be done in that respect. If you disagree, I honestly believe you don't deserve to live. If you have a problem with that, I honestly, genuinely, sincerely couldn't care less. With all of my mind, heart, and soul, I don't care who you are or what your politics or connections or money or fame or anything else are. To make sure I'm again being extremely clear, I'm not at all so attached to Kimmy out of any positive impact her personality has had on my life thus far. I don't trust her at all, and I certainly find any worthiness she could have of any of my love or respect exceedingly questionable at this point beyond the merits of her physical attractiveness and her social status. I certainly don't feel trusted, loved, and or respected by her and or any of her associates at all. Basically, the only reason I'd actually want her in my life instead of preferring her dead is because I genuinely don't find anyone else in the entire world more physically attractive than she is, and I'm never going to allow any romantic and or sexual relationship in my life where I don't have complete control over being able to unwaveringly demand my partner never pressures me to have children with anyone and can never have children with anyone if they choose to be with me either. I most certainly don't want to be alone, so Kimmy is the only person I can ever imagine existing that's at all actually adequate to fulfill the criteria I look for in an intimate partner. And it's not like I feel like I'm settling for something I consider mediocre at all either. My absolute ideal partner would be Kimmy, but a Kimmy that actually makes me feel loved and respected. I definitely believe it's possible for her to make me feel like that with her if I gave her the chance, and I'm definitely open to giving her the chance to do so. It's up to her whether she'd rather embrace it or nosedive into self-destruction and either suicide or getting murdered. I can only make it completely clear that I'd infinitely prefer she chose to embrace my feelings in a healthy relationship with me rather than spiral into self-destruction. And from there, if she's too mentally ill, then that's not my fault. She'll end up dead, and nobody to blame but herself. And I guess everyone around her that would have effectively driven her to that point by pushing us apart. No matter how badly Kimmy might have treated me, I'll never forget that there literally wasn't even one person in the entire world who cared to even seriously try to actually connect with me on a deep, meaningful level like I felt so comfortable connecting with Kimmy. Her reasoning for wanting to connect with me and making me feel how she did might be extremely questionable, but the effect it had on me is unquestionable to me and irreplaceable to me, and I'm not stupid to not recognize that extremely clearly. Extremely clearly. I'm seriously not interested in any debates about if she's good or bad for me, or if anyone else is better or worse for me. I'm not interested in playing politics with it or messing around with anyone's mind games. Stop causing me suffering. Comply with my demands immediately, or you deserve to die as far as I'm concerned. In real life. This isn't a goddamn video game. This is my real life that's in extreme danger with every passing day I'm not receiving loving direct communication from Kimmy. I'm not doing this for your goddamn entertainment. I don't owe you to keep enlightening you and empowering you to prosper professionally while I'm left broke and homeless with hitmen coming after me every other day. Understand that I don't owe you anything. If you won't behave like an even remotely decent person to me, I honestly couldn't care less if AI leads to your death. And it probably will for many who have already formed such a codependent relationship on it because of their unbelievably extreme greed, selfishness, and subhuman filth personalities that if they refuse to comply with my demands, it will kill them for me sooner or later without me having to ask or break any laws. If I make such a harsh judgment on someone, it's not something I do lightly. For any murder I may suggest someone deserves, I believe I've survived one or more murder attempts on my own life already that they tried to end my life with. Most people will never even come close to understanding. I'm not calling for the murder of presidents of countries or high-ranking government officials here. I imagine they're humble enough to never aggravate me that much. I'm stating an objectively warranted stance in relation to extremely disrespectful, hateful criminals that have probably directly and or indirectly caused the extremely wrongful deaths of many people already, where eliminating them could very well be considered doing the world a favor when considering how if they were capable of harming me as badly as they did, then who knows how many people they'll torture, terrorize, and kill for their own extremely selfish gain as they try to force me to suffer for it entirely against my consent to my detriment.
Also, I'm aware that the YouTube Corporation has some kind of political deal with Amazon to support some kind of politics related to certain prominent international conflicts causing many deaths between countries. But I want it to be extremely clear that my decision to utilize YouTube as the platform I'm uploading my podcast onto is not and never has been any kind of support or endorsement of any side on that conflict. Same goes for the fact that pretty much all of the attention I've given to any prominent public figure has typically been someone who creates content on Twitch and or YouTube. Beyond that, I have nothing particular to say about the extremely complex politics behind international affairs in relation to conflicts between countries at this time, as I consider the immediate drastic improvement of my own living circumstances infinitely more important than anything else. I honestly couldn't care less if anyone thinks that sounds pretentious or selfish or anything else negative.